The night was still on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, February 1990. A cold wind moved across the open plains, carrying with it the sound of silence that only wide country can hold. The small town of Riverton rested under a pale moon, and most homes had already gone dark. At her aunt's modest wooden house near the edge of town, 22-year-old Elena Whitefeather had just finished her evening visit. A coffee mug sat on the kitchen table, steam still curling into the air. Elena had promised her aunt she would return to her dorm at the University of Wyoming before midnight. It was an ordinary night. There was no warning that it would be her last. At around 9 p.m., Elena stepped out into the cold. She walked to her old Chevy sedan parked on the gravel driveway. The headlights came on, casting beams across the dirt road. She waved once toward the window where her aunt stood, then drove away into the Wyoming night. 2 miles down a lonely road that cut between empty fields, something happened. The car would later be discovered at the side of the path, engine still running, driver's door ajar, and headlights piercing into the darkness. Elena was gone. When her cousin Daniel Whitefeather drove past that same stretch of road less than an hour later, he noticed a glow of headlights pointing toward nothing. He slowed his truck and stepped out. The cold bit sharply at his face. As he approached, he saw Elena's car idling. The driver's seat was empty. Her purse was still inside. A coffee mug sat in the cup holder, still faintly warm to the touch. Daniel called out her name into the night air. His voice carried across the plain, but only silence answered. There were faint marks in the dirt, impressions that looked like a struggle had taken place beside the car. The tracks of another vehicle, possibly a truck, veered off toward the main road. Panic rose in Daniel's chest. He raced back into town and alerted family members. Within the hour, the Whitefeathers gathered at the road, their flashlights sweeping over the frozen ground. Each beam revealed only emptiness. The reservation police soon arrived, followed by the Fremont County Sheriff's deputies. Questions filled the night. Where was Elena? Who had been here? And why was her car left like this? Investigators examined the vehicle carefully. The driver's door had not been forced. The keys were still in the ignition. Elena's coat lay on the passenger seat, untouched. One officer noticed a faint smudge on the door handle, as though someone with dirty hands had gripped it. A set of boot prints led away from the car, but the wind had already begun to erase them. By morning, word spread across Riverton and throughout the Wind River Reservation. Elena Whitefeather, a young woman known for her bright spirit and her devotion to her family, had vanished without a trace. Neighbors whispered at gas stations and in diners. Parents warned their daughters not to travel alone at night. For the Whitefeather family, fear and disbelief sank heavily into their hearts. Detectives canvassed the area. A rancher reported hearing a truck rumble down the road at high speed around the same time Elena disappeared. Another witness claimed he saw a shadowy figure near the abandoned car, but could not give details. Each account was vague, and none provided solid answers. The search stretched into the surrounding fields. Volunteers combed through brush, irrigation ditches, and stretches of frozen ground. They called Elena's name again and again, but the plains returned only silence. Helicopters swept over the reservation, their spotlights cutting through the early morning fog. Still, no sign of her emerged. As the days passed, the car remained a haunting image, an open door swinging slightly in the wind, an engine that refused to stop, and a mug of coffee gone cold. It stood as a silent witness to whatever horror had unfolded on that lonely road. For investigators, one fact became immediately clear. This was not a case of someone walking away from life. Elena had not run. She had not planned to disappear. Something or someone had taken her. In a small Wyoming town where everyone knew one another, suspicion began to spread quickly. Was the person responsible a stranger passing through? Or was the danger far closer to home? The night of February 1990 left behind no body, no answers, only a car and a question that would haunt the reservation for decades. And as the investigation began to unravel, one painful truth would emerge. Solving this disappearance would not be simple. It would become a battle against time, memory, and silence. The case of Elena Whitefeather had only just begun. Before the night of her disappearance, Elena Whitefeather was more than just a name in a case file. She was a young woman with a story, a family, and dreams that reached far beyond the boundaries of her small community. Born in 1968, Elena grew up on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. The wide skies and open fields shaped her childhood. She was the second of 3 children, with an older brother, Daniel, and a younger sister, Rose. Her father worked as a mechanic in Riverton, while her mother, Margaret, was known for her beadwork, crafting intricate designs that carried the traditions of the Northern Arapaho tribe. From an early age, Elena showed a quiet strength. She was compassionate toward others, often helping her grandmother tend to the elders in the community. She carried food, read letters for those who struggled with eyesight, and listened patiently to stories of hardship and survival. She understood the weight of history, yet she looked toward the future with determination. Education became her path forward. By the time she reached high school, Elena was already tutoring younger students, especially those who struggled with English. She believed that teacher was more than just a job. It was a responsibility. Her dream was to graduate from the University of Wyoming with a degree in education and return to the reservation as a teacher. She wanted to inspire Native youth to believe in their own strength, to help them build opportunities that had often been denied to earlier generations. Friends described Elena as warm, approachable, and deeply loyal. She was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, who stayed late to help with homework, and who never ignored someone in need. Yet she also carried the vulnerability of a young woman trying to balance 2 worlds, the traditional life of her community and the modern expectations of university life. Her move to Laramie for college had not been easy. At first, she felt out of place, surrounded by students who did not share her background or her struggles. But Elena refused to let that discourage her. She worked part-time at the campus library, studied late into the night, and returned home often to stay connected with her family. Every trip back to Riverton reminded her why she was working so hard. Elena's connection to her Arapaho roots was evident in everything she did. She wore a small turquoise pendant her grandmother had given her at graduation, a reminder of strength and identity. She attended tribal ceremonies whenever she could, dancing in traditional dress during summer gatherings. She believed education and culture could walk together, each giving meaning to the other. To those who knew her best, Elena carried a gentle resilience. She was not someone who sought attention, but she left an impression wherever she went. Her professors praised her focus. Her classmates admired her kindness, and her family relied on her steady presence. At 22, Elena's life stood at the edge of promise. She talked about applying for teaching positions back on the reservation, possibly even starting a community program for young girls. She wanted to prove that success was possible without leaving behind the land and people she loved. But even with all her determination, Elena remained vulnerable. Riverton in 1990 was a place where opportunities were scarce, and dangers were often hidden in plain sight. Young women, especially Native women, faced risks that were too easily overlooked by outsiders. Elena was aware of those risks, yet she believed her future was strong enough to overcome them. To her family, she was not just a student or a dreamer. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She laughed easily, loved deeply, and carried hopes that stretched far beyond the horizon of the Wyoming plains. And it was that bright, determined spirit that made her sudden disappearance all the more devastating. The loss was not only of a young woman, but of everything she could have become. The evening of February 12, 1990, carried the stillness of winter across the Wind River Reservation. The sun had already slipped below the horizon, leaving only the faint glow of moonlight scattered across the plains. At her aunt's small home in Riverton, Elena Whitefeather stood in the kitchen, gathering her coat and books. She had spent the afternoon visiting family, sharing stories, and drinking a warm cup of coffee. At around 9 p.m., she hugged her aunt goodbye and promised to call once she arrived back in her dorm at the University of Wyoming. Her aunt watched from the window as Elena stepped into the cold night air, her boots crunching against the gravel driveway. She opened the door of her Chevy sedan, slid inside, and started the engine. The headlights cut a path through the darkness. With one final wave, Elena drove off toward the main road. The drive should have taken only minutes. But Elena never arrived at her dorm. Less than an hour later, her cousin Daniel Whitefeather, returning from a late errand, noticed something strange as he traveled down a lonely stretch of dirt road. Two beams of headlights pierced the night. Fixed in place as though staring at nothing, he slowed his truck, uneasy. As he drew closer, he recognized Elena's Chevy sedan. The engine was still running. The driver's side door stood wide open, and the front tires pressed slightly into the ditch. The cold, Wyoming wind whistled through the open frame. Daniel stepped out, his boots sinking into the frozen ground. He called her name. Only silence answered. He peered inside the car. Her purse rested on the passenger seat, untouched. Her coat lay neatly folded beside it. In the cup holder, the same coffee mug from earlier still held a trace of warmth. On the dirt road, the faint outline of footprints told a troubling story. The impressions appeared hurried, uneven, as though a struggle had taken place. Just beyond them, tire tracks from a larger vehicle curved sharply back toward the highway. Daniel felt his stomach sink. Something was terribly wrong. He raced back to town and returned with family members. Together, they stood around the car, flashlights sweeping across the desolate road. The beams illuminated broken twigs, scattered dirt, and a strange pattern of marks leading away from the vehicle. It looked as if someone had dragged Elena from her car, but no one could be sure. Within the hour, both tribal police and Fremont County deputies arrived. The scene was roped off, but in the vast openness of Wyoming, evidence was already fading. The wind erased details quickly, carrying away what little remained. Investigators examined the car carefully. No signs of forced entry. No broken glass. Key still in the ignition. It looked as though Elena had simply stepped out and vanished. Witnesses began to surface. A farmer driving home around the same time reported seeing a pickup truck idling near the same road. He remembered its taillights glowing red in the distance before it sped away. Another resident later recalled a tall man standing near the abandoned sedan, but the image was faint, a fleeting moment in the dark. Nothing was certain. For the investigators, possibilities multiplied. Could Elena have been abducted? Had she run into trouble with someone she knew? Or could it have been voluntary? A decision to disappear, though nothing in her life suggested she would? Each scenario seemed possible, yet none fit her character or her plans. The discovery of her car became the chilling centerpiece of the case. Photographs captured as officers found it that night. Headlights blazing into the empty plains. Driver's door hanging open like an unanswered question. It was a frozen moment, a snapshot of terror, standing still in time. The community reacted quickly. Search parties formed within hours. Volunteers scoured fields, ravines, and back roads with lanterns and dogs. They called Elena's name again and again, their voices swallowed by the vast Wyoming silence. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights sweeping across the reservation. Still, no trace of her was found. By the following morning, Riverton was alive with whispers. Parents kept children close. Women avoided traveling alone at night. In a place where everyone knew everyone else, the thought of such a disappearance felt unreal. But the abandoned car told a truth no one wanted to accept. Elena Whitefeather had not left willingly. The unanswered questions lingered like the cold air itself. Who had stopped her on that road? Why had her car been left behind, untouched yet abandoned? And where was Elena now? The image of that car, humming quietly on a lonely stretch of dirt road, would remain burned into the memory of her family and investigators alike. It was not just a vehicle. It was the last sign of a young woman whose life had been interrupted in the most violent way imaginable. And as days turned to weeks, the question grew sharper, more urgent, and more painful. Had Elena been taken by a stranger, or was the danger far closer than anyone realized? The mystery of her disappearance was only beginning to unfold. In the days after Elena Whitefeather's disappearance, law enforcement moved quickly, but the investigation was troubled from the very beginning. The case fell into hands of both the Fremont County Sheriff's Office and the Wind River Tribal Police, two agencies that share responsibility but often struggle with overlapping authority. That conflict would shadow every step of the inquiry. On the first morning, detectives examined the abandoned car again in daylight. Tire marks in the dirt told part of the story. A second vehicle, larger than Elena's, had been present. The impression suggested a pickup truck. Beside the car, a single partial boot print was discovered, pressed into the frozen ground. It was photographed in cast and plaster, but without a clear tread pattern. It offered little to identify a suspect. Interviews began immediately. Elena's family described her as focused, responsible, and deeply devoted to her studies. Her professors at the University of Wyoming confirmed she had been excelling in her coursework. Friends insisted she had no reason to leave her life behind. No enemies were named. No threats had ever been reported. Investigators faced the first troubling reality. Elena seemed to vanish without motive. Attention soon turned to those who had been closest to her. One of the first names on the list was David Crowhorse, her former boyfriend. David, 24, lived in Riverton and had dated Elena during her first year of college. The relationship ended months before her disappearance, but investigators pressed him for answers. David admitted he had been upset when Elena left him, but he denied any involvement in her disappearance. He explained that on the night she vanished, he had been drinking with friends at a local bar. Witnesses confirmed his presence, though his alibi left a small window of time unaccounted for. Detectives noted his defensiveness, but without evidence linking him to the abandoned car, suspicion could not move forward. Investigators also questioned a group of men known to gather near the dirt road where Elena's car was found. Locals had often complained about their drinking and late-night behavior. On the night of February 12th, several of them admitted to being in the area, though none claimed to have seen Elena. Their stories were inconsistent. One man said he left early. Another insisted they had stayed until midnight. Officers suspected they were hiding something, but again, no direct evidence tied them to the crime. As the investigation deepened, tension grew between the two agencies. Tribal police believed they should lead the inquiry, since Elena was a member of the Northern Arapaho tribe and the disappearance occurred within reservation boundaries. Fremont County detectives argued the car had been discovered on a county road, which gave them jurisdiction. Meetings were tense, communication uneven. At times, crucial details slipped between the cracks. Despite the conflict, both sides continued searching for answers. Officers canvassed Riverton, interviewing store owners, drivers, and anyone who might pass the road that night. Flyers with Elena's photograph were posted on bulletin boards, gas stations, and church doors. Volunteers combed fields once more, hoping for any sign. Each effort ended in the same silence. The partial boot print remained the only physical evidence of real value, but it led nowhere. When compared against local suspects, no match was made. The tire impression suggested a common pickup truck model, which narrowed nothing. Without DNA technology advanced enough to test the samples collected from the car, investigators were left staring at evidence that offered no answers. Weeks passed. The community grew restless. The Whitefeather family asked for updates daily, but detectives could provide only frustration. Rumors spread to the reservation. Whispers that Elena might have been taken by someone she knew, or that she had been targeted by an outsider passing through. Each rumor created suspicion, and suspicion created division. By the end of the first month, the investigation had lost momentum. Detectives had questioned everyone they could, collected every scrap of evidence, and still held nothing that explained what happened on that cold night in 1990. For Elena's family, hope clung to the belief that someone, somewhere, had seen something. For investigators, the reality was darker. Evidence was slipping away with each passing day, and the truth seemed buried deeper in silence. And as the investigation faltered, the weight of uncertainty began to settle heavily across the community, a silence that threatened to last for decades. The disappearance of Elena Whitefeather struck the Wind River Reservation with force that few could put into words. In a community bound tightly by family, culture, and shared history, the loss of one young woman felt like the loss of a future. Elena was not only a daughter and a student. She was a symbol of hope. Her dream of becoming a teacher for Native youth had resonated deeply, and when she vanished, that dream seemed stolen from everyone. The Whitefeather family was devastated. Her mother, Margaret Whitefeather, carried the heaviest burden. Margaret had always described Elena as the child who carried light into every room. Now she found herself walking into empty spaces filled only with silence. In the weeks after the disappearance, Margaret became a quiet but persistent force. While she did not shout or demand attention, her steady presence reminded investigators, neighbors, and journalists that Elena's life could not be forgotten. Her father and brothers organized search parties alongside tribal volunteers. Men and women combed the fields, riverbanks, and backroads, carrying flashlights late into the night. Pickup trucks formed long convoys across the plains, dust rising as dozens of community members drove miles in the hope of finding something, anything, that might bring Elena home. Vigils soon followed. Dozens gathered outside the tribal offices, holding candles against the cold Wyoming wind. Songs were sung in Arapaho, prayers lifted in English, and mothers held their children close. The vigils became more than moments of grief. They were demonstrations of resilience. Even as days turned into weeks, the community refused to let Elena's name fade. Posters with her photograph appeared across Riverton and surrounding towns. They were taped to grocery store windows, stapled to telephone poles, and tacked to church bulletin boards. Her smiling face looked back at strangers in gas stations, laundromats, and diners. Missing, Elena Whitefeather, became a phrase that echoed across Fremont County. Yet alongside the unity came frustration. Many in the community voiced what they had long felt, that cases involving Native women rarely received the urgency given to others. Relatives pointed out that when white women disappeared in Wyoming, headlines spread quickly, news stations covered every development, and law enforcement pushed with visible determination. For Elena, the pace felt slower, the urgency dimmer. Tribal members asked why. Why did their daughters, sisters, and mothers not receive the same protection? Margaret Whitefeather never stopped asking. In public, her words were few, but her eyes carried a strength that demanded remembrance. At meetings with investigators, she listened carefully, pressing for updates. At vigils, she stood quietly in the front, her hands clasped, her grief hidden beneath unshakable resolve. Over the years, she became a symbol herself, a mother who refused to let silence bury her child. For the tribal community, Elena's disappearance was not just a personal tragedy. It became a mirror reflecting generations of loss, neglect, and unanswered questions. Each prayer, each candle, and each search across the plains was a way of saying, Elena mattered, her life mattered, and until justice was found, her name would never be forgotten. Underscore. The months following Elena Whitefeather's disappearance brought not only grief, but also a string of false hopes. Each new lead seemed to promise answers, yet each one collapsed under the weight of disappointment. For investigators and family alike, the journey became a cycle of cautious hope, followed by crushing silence. The first major lead came from Denver. A caller reported seeing a young Native woman matching Elena's description near a downtown bus terminal. She was said to be traveling with two men, looking anxious, and carrying only a small bag. Detectives traveled hundreds of miles to follow up. They interviewed bus station employees, collected security logs, and even showed Elena's photograph around the neighborhood. For several days, the Whitefeather family clung to the possibility that Elena might still be alive. But when investigators finally located the woman in question, the truth was clear. It was not her. The relief of solving the mystery of that sighting was swallowed instantly by the despair of losing hope once again. Another tip suggested that Elena had been taken by a stranger passing through the reservation. A truck driver claimed he had seen a young woman forced into a pickup along a desolate stretch of highway. The story gained attention quickly, and for a brief moment, it seemed to align with the pickup truck that other witnesses had reported near Elena's abandoned car. Detectives poured time into tracing vehicles registered in the area, stopping drivers and running checks. But nothing solid emerged. No suspect was identified, and no connection could be proven. What seemed like a breakthrough dissolved into dust. The most unsettling twist came when a man stepped forward and confessed to killing Elena. He was a drifter, arrested on unrelated charges in Montana. During questioning, he told officers he had picked up a young Native woman in Wyoming in 1990 and left her body in a ravine. Investigators rushed to verify his story, combing through records and arranging searches in remote areas. For weeks, the possibility of closure loomed painfully close. Yet inconsistencies piled up. His timeline did not match. His details were vague. In the end, his confession was revealed as nothing more than a fabrication, a bid for attention and leniency in his own case. The Whitefeather family endured another wave of emotional torment, forced to relive the disappearance only to learn it had been manipulated by a stranger's lies. Back in Riverton, rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that Elena had run away willingly, unable to handle the pressures of college and expectations. Others speculated about darker possibilities, that someone close to her had betrayed her. The absence of truth created fertile ground for speculation, and every whispered theory weighed heavily on her family. For investigators, the greatest frustration was the evidence that sat just out of reach. Biological samples had been collected from Elena's car, traces on the seat, smudges on the door handle, and fibers on her clothing. But in 1990, DNA testing was in its infancy. The technology could not provide the answers that might be possible today. The samples were boxed, labeled, and stored, but they remained silent. As the years passed, those boxes gathered dust on evidence room shelves, symbols of both potential and paralysis. By the mid-1990s, the case had stalled. Detectives had followed every lead, from reported sightings to confessions to whispered rumors, yet none had brought them closer to the truth. Each false lead had chipped away at morale. Each dead end had added weight to the grief of the Whitefeather family. And within the community, the disappearance of Elena Whitefeather became not only a tragedy, but also a haunting reminder of justice deferred. The silence that followed was perhaps the hardest to bear. The trail had gone cold, and the unanswered questions grew louder with time. What really happened on that dirt road in 1990? Who had taken Elena away? The reservation waited, hoping one day the truth would finally emerge. By the mid-1990s, Elena Whitefeather's case had slipped into silence. The search efforts that once mobilized entire neighborhoods had slowed to a whisper. Detectives who once chased lead with urgency turned to other files, other names, other tragedies. Her disappearance remained unsolved, a thin folder sitting beneath stacks of newer cases. In the Fremont County Sheriff's Office, Elena's photograph was still there, tacked to a corkboard, but the edges had curled with time, and the once bright image began to fade under the constant glow of fluorescent lights. It was a quiet reminder of a mystery left unresolved, a ghost among the living. For the Whitefeather family, life became measured not in days, but in absences. Holidays came and went with an empty seat at the table. Birthdays passed with no candles to blow out, no cards written, no laughter. Elena's younger cousins grew up, graduating from high school and starting families of their own. Each milestone underscored the truth of what was missing. Her mother, Margaret, carried the silence in her eyes. She spoke less, but her presence at tribal gatherings remained steady. At every community meeting where safety was discussed, she reminded leaders, softly, firmly, that Elena was still gone. Over time, her voice became the constant thread in the story everyone else was trying to forget. The community, too, felt the weight. For years after, mothers told their daughters not to drive alone at night. Fathers insisted on picking up their children from school dances. Elena's disappearance was more than a case. It was a wound that changed the way people lived. Detectives, even those new to the department, knew Elena's name. It was spoken in briefing rooms, often as an example how a promising lead could vanish into nothing. Younger officers asked questions, only to hear the same answer. It went cold. There were no new witnesses, no breakthroughs in technology yet, no confession to bring resolution. By the late 1990s, the silence became unbearable. Rumors faded, tips stopped, and even the newspapers no longer carried her story. What had once gripped the community as a shocking mystery had now become a shadow, a painful reminder that some cases never moved forward. Yet for Margaret and the Whitefeather family, time did not dull the ache. It sharpened it. Each year without answers deepened the sense of injustice. The family prayed, not for miracles, but for something as small as a phone call, a clue, a fragment of truth. But the phone never rang, and the silence stretched into decades. The coldness of the case was not only in the files, but in the air of the reservation. A sense of unfinished business hung over every gathering, every memory of Elena. And beneath it all, the same haunting question endured. How could someone vanish so completely, leaving behind only a running car and a family frozen in grief? The years moved on, but the wound remained open. For 30 years, the boxes sat quietly in storage. Dust gathered on their lids, labels yellowed with time, and the weight of neglect pressed down on every sealed bag inside. Elena Whitefeather's case had become the symbol of silence, a cold trail that seemed frozen forever. But in 2021, that silence cracked. A new program, funded through federal grants and the cooperation of state crime labs, had begun re-examining long unsolved cases in Wyoming. At the heart of the initiative was a tool that did not exist in 1990. Forensic genealogy. Unlike traditional DNA testing, which had failed to deliver results in the early days, this program used modern databases and family tree tracing to reveal connections hidden for decades. When investigators reopened Elena's evidence box, they found preserved swabs from the interior of her car. Despite the years, the samples had been stored carefully, shielded from contamination. Scientists at the lab held their breath as they began the process of extracting what remained. The molecules of DNA were fragile, broken down by time, but they were there, waiting. For weeks, the lab technicians worked meticulously. Computers hummed, charts flickered, and fragments of code were pieced together. Finally, one evening, the results began to take shape. It was not a full match, but it was something more powerful, a partial DNA connection, strong enough to point toward a family name. The data led to a Wyoming family with deep roots in Fremont County, a name that had surfaced only faintly in the original investigation, but never firmly tied to crime. At first, detectives struggled to believe it. Could it be possible that after decades of silence, the answer had been hiding in plain sight? Detective Angela Martinez, who had taken over cold case responsibilities in recent years, studied the file late into the night. The fluorescent light cast shadows over the faded photographs of Elena. On her desk lay the new report, glowing with potential. The DNA connection pointed to several male relatives within a single family. Any one of them could have been responsible. Martinez felt a chill as she considered the possibilities. She thought of the countless hours the Whitefeather family had endured without answers, of Margaret Whitefeather's quiet resilience, of the vigils that had lit the Wyoming night. For the first time in decades, the case had movement. Detectives began digging into the family tree. Census records, property documents, and archive reports from the 1990s resurfaced. The threads started to weave together. Among the family was a man who had lived near Riverton at the time of Elena's disappearance. He drove a pickup truck, worked odd jobs on the reservation, and had a history of minor offenses. Nothing violent enough to raise alarms back then. His name had been whispered once during the original investigation, but dismissed for lack of evidence. The DNA pointed back to him, circling his name like a predator, closing in. As the news spread quietly through law enforcement channels, suspense built. Detectives knew they had to move carefully. The evidence was powerful, but after 30 years, memories faded, witnesses disappeared, and records were incomplete. A single mistake could unravel the chance to finally solve the case. The Whitefeather family was informed cautiously. Margaret listened in silence as Detective Martinez explained the possibility of a breakthrough. Her hands trembled, not from shock, but from the weight of years spent waiting. She had lived through countless false leads and dead ends. Hope was dangerous. But this was different. This was science, rooted in truth that could not be erased by rumor or lies. Meanwhile, the community began to stir. Word of DNA testing circulated, sparking quiet conversations in kitchens, on front porches, and at community centers. Some felt relief that justice might finally be near. Others braced themselves, fearful of the name that might be revealed. Because on reservations and in small towns, everyone is connected. In the sterile hum of the crime lab, a sample from the suspect's living relatives was compared against the evidence. Each run of the test brought detectives closer to certainty. The match percentage climbed. Decades of silence were about to give way to a revelation that would shake the reservation to its core. The answers that had been locked away in dust and darkness were now rising to the surface. And for the first time since 1990, the truth felt within reach. Detective Amy Rodriguez joined the Fremont County Sheriff's Office in 2019. Young, meticulous, and unyielding in her sense of duty, she carried a reputation for chasing details others overlooked. When the cold case files were reassigned, she found herself staring at a box labeled White Feather, Elena, 1990. At first glance, the folder looked like so many others. Faded photographs, brittle notes, and transcripts of interviews that had long since gone quiet. But as Rodriguez read through each page, something shifted. She felt the weight of 30 years pressing from the paper. Unlike many cases that sat in archives, this one had DNA newly revived by forensic genealogy. It was not just a cold case. It was a puzzle waiting to be solved. Rodriguez began where others had stopped, with the people. She tracked down every surviving witness who had spoken to investigators in 1990. Sitting in living rooms, nursing cups of coffee, she listened patiently as older voices recalled foggy memories. Many had moved on, but small fragments of detail emerged, fragments that the original investigation had dismissed as too minor or unreliable. One elderly ranch hand remembered a young man who often worked seasonal jobs near the reservation during the summer of 1990. He drove an old pickup, light blue with rust along the fenders. The man's name had appeared once in an early report, but only in passing. The ranch hand swore he had seen that truck near Riverton around the time Elena disappeared. Rodriguez circled the name. It matched the family line that the new DNA test had pointed to. Piece by piece, she retraced the old investigation, hunting for missed opportunities. She requested employment records from farms and construction sites, combed through court dockets for minor charges, and checked addresses that had long since been abandoned. Slowly, the figure of a suspect emerged, someone who had slipped through the cracks because no one had looked closely enough. The man's name was Richard Hale. In 1990, he had been 24 years old, moving between temporary jobs and known for spending weekends drinking on back roads near the reservation. He had no violent record, no arrest that would have drawn suspicion, but his proximity, his vehicle, and now the DNA link tied him firmly to the shadows of Elena's disappearance. Rodriguez's colleagues admired her persistence, but worried about her obsession. Night after night, she stayed in the office long after the others had left. Pages of Elena's files spread across her desk. She studied the old photographs of the abandoned car, the boot print in the dirt, the sketches of tire tracks. She believed these were not just forgotten images, but silent witnesses waiting for someone to listen. Her determination soon caught the attention of state investigators, who offered resources to support her work. With their help, she expanded the DNA testing and ran comparisons on Richard Hale's surviving relatives. Each result drew the circle tighter, narrowing the focus toward him. For Rodriguez, the case became more than duty. It became a symbol of justice denied for far too long. She thought often of Margaret Whitefeather, who had carried her daughter's absence with quiet dignity for 3 decades. Rodriguez believed she owed Margaret the truth, and she refused to let another year pass without answers. As the evidence mounted, suspicion hardened into certainty. The threads of genealogy, witness recollections, and overlooked reports converged on Richard Hale. Detective Amy Rodriguez was no longer chasing shadows. She was standing at the edge of revelation. The time had come to confront the man who had evaded justice for over 30 years. The DNA trail left little room for doubt. The partial match had narrowed investigators' focus until one name stood out in sharp relief: Mark Jensen. In 1990, Jensen was 28 years old, a white ranch hand who floated from job to job across Fremont County. He spent nights drinking heavily in Riverton bars, often leaving behind a trail of broken bottles and bitter arguments. People who remembered him from that time spoke cautiously. He had a reputation for quick tempers and unrestrained aggression, especially toward Native women, whom he often targeted with slurs and unwanted advances. When Detective Amy Rodriguez pieced the puzzle together, she felt the weight of inevitability. The evidence, the genealogy, the witness recollections, all of it converged on Jensen. It was time to bring him in. The arrest was quiet. Officers approached him at his modest home on the outskirts of Riverton, a place cluttered with tools, worn furniture, and memories of decades lived in isolation. Now 60, Jensen looked weathered but still carried the same hard edge. He did not resist as handcuffs closed around his wrists. Perhaps he already knew the silence of 30 years had ended. At the sheriff's office, the interrogation room felt colder than usual. Rodriguez sat across from Jensen, a folder thick with photographs and reports between them. A recording light blinked steadily, marking every word. "Mark," Rodriguez began, her tone even, "we have DNA evidence linking you to Elena Whitefeather's car the night she disappeared in 1990. Jensen leaned back, arms crossed. His voice was dismissive. "That was 30 years ago. DNA, genealogy, those things are not perfect. You must be mistaken." Rodriguez slid a photograph across the table. The abandoned car, headlights glowing in the dark Wyoming night. "This is not a mistake," she said. "Your DNA was found inside. Witnesses remember your pickup near the dirt road. We know you were there." For hours, Jensen deflected. He claimed he had never known Elena. He insisted investigators were framing him, that the science was flawed, that memories from 1990 could not be trusted. Yet the more he denied, the more Rodriguez pressed. She spoke of the tire marks, the boot print, the witnesses who had seen his blue pickup truck. Each detail chipped at the armor he had worn for decades. Finally, Rodriguez leaned forward, her voice firm but quiet. "Mark, this is your chance to tell the truth. Elena's family has waited 30 years. They deserve to know what happened. You owe them that much." Jensen's eyes faltered, his breathing slowed, and the room grew still. He rubbed his hands against the table, the cuffs rattling faintly. Then, in a voice rough with resignation, he whispered she would not get in the truck. Rodriguez remained silent, letting the words hang. Jensen lowered his head. "I had been drinking all night. Saw her walking. Pulled over, thought she might want to ride. She said no. She told me to leave her alone." His jaw tightened, the words forced through clenched teeth. "I grabbed her. She fought back, scratched me, screamed at me. I got angry, too angry." The confession unraveled slowly, painfully. He admitted forcing Elena into his pickup. The rage and alcohol blurred his judgment, turning rejection into violence. By the time he realized what he'd done, it was too late. "I left her," he muttered. "Took her to a ravine off the old service road. Nobody ever goes out there. I thought no one would ever find her." Rodriguez's hands tightened into fists beneath the table, but her voice stayed calm. "Why, Mark? Why her?" He looked up, eyes hollow. "Because she told me no." The word struck with devastating clarity, the truth behind 3 decades of silence. The interrogation ended with Jensen's written statement, every word recorded, every detail secured. He would later lead investigators to the ravine, a remote stretch of land scarred by wind and time. Their partial remains were recovered, confirming confession, ending years of unanswered questions. When the news reached the Whitefeather family, grief returned, sharper than before, yet tempered by the knowledge that truth had finally been spoken. For 30 years, Elena's name had been a question. Now it was an answer, carried on the broken voice of the man who had stolen her life. But justice was not yet complete. The arrest was only the beginning. The morning of Mark Jensen's arrest in 2022 was one of those moments that felt unreal to many in Riverton and across the Wind River Reservation. For more than 3 decades, Elena Whitefeather's name had existed in the shadow of unsolved. Families had built entire lives in the time since, but her loved ones never stopped counting the days. And then, with the thud of a gavel and the click of handcuffs, everything changed. Sheriff's deputies, working with tribal authorities, arrived at Jensen's modest home outside of Riverton before sunrise. Neighbors watched as a man who had blended quietly into the community for so many years was led away in handcuffs. He looked older, grayer, but in the eyes of the Whitefeather family, he was still the same man who had stolen Elena's future. The image of him being escorted into a waiting patrol car was broadcast across Wyoming, reigniting outrage, sorrow, and relief all at once. Inside the courthouse, the weight of history pressed against the walls. Elena's family filled the benches, her mother Margaret sitting between her sons, clutching a rosary worn smooth from decades of use. When Jensen appeared, dressed in an orange jumpsuit and shackles, a wave of emotion swept the room. Margaret wept quietly, finally seeing the man responsible for her daughter's disappearance brought to face justice. For years, she had pleaded for someone to take her daughter's case seriously. Now, that persistence was vindicated. But the arrest was not simply about Jensen. It forced a painful reckoning for the community. For 32 years, he had lived openly in Fremont County, working jobs, drinking in bars, and passing unnoticed. The fact that a known figure had been tied to one of the reservation's darkest mysteries left many shaken. People whispered in church pews and gas stations, asking how the truth had stayed buried for so long. The question carried no easy answer, only the acknowledgement that justice had come painfully late. The tribal community responded with both relief and outrage. Relief that Elena's name would not remain a footnote in Wyoming's long list of unsolved crimes. Outrage that it had taken advanced DNA technology and the relentless push of a new detective to achieve what should have happened decades ago. Elders spoke openly about the broader pattern. How missing Native women were too often ignored or dismissed, their cases left cold, while others gained immediate national attention. Elena's case became a rallying point for activists demanding reforms, from better cooperation between tribal and county law enforcement to stronger federal oversight. National media picked up the story, framing it as both a long overdue breakthrough and a glaring example of systemic neglect. Commentators emphasized the legal loopholes that had complicated the original investigation, the tug-of-war between tribal police and county detectives that allowed Jensen to slip through the cracks. Elena's story, once relegated to local headlines, now represented a much larger issue facing indigenous communities across the country. For the Whitefeather family, however, the moment was deeply personal. After Jensen's confession, search teams recovered Elena's remains in a remote ravine where he had abandoned her body in 1990. Her family was finally able to give her a proper burial, complete with traditional Arapaho rites. The ceremony, attended by hundreds, was both heartbreaking and healing. For the first time in more than 3 decades, they could lay flowers on her grave, no longer searching but remembering. As Jensen awaited trial, the courthouse in Riverton became a place of pilgrimage. Strangers who had never known Elena stopped by to attend hearings, offering support to the Whitefeathers. Margaret, once a quiet figure on the sidelines, stood before cameras and lawmakers, her voice steady as she demanded lasting change. She reminded the world that Elena was more than a case file. She was a daughter, a sister, and a dreamer who wanted to teach the next generation. Justice had finally arrived, though years too late. For some, it was enough. For others, it was a reminder that time lost could never be restored. But in Riverton and across the Wind River Reservation, the arrest of Mark Jensen marked a turning point, a moment when silence gave way to truth and a community scarred by loss found a measure of closure. Elena Whitefeather's story is more than the tragedy of a life stolen too soon. It is a story of family who refused to surrender to silence and a community that carried her memory across 3 long decades. Her mother, Margaret, became a symbol of quiet strength, reminding the world that justice may falter, but it must never be abandoned. This case teaches us that truth can be buried, delayed, and ignored, but it cannot be erased. Advances in science and the persistence of determined investigators finally lifted the weight of uncertainty. Yet the lesson reaches further. Every victim deserves a voice, no matter how much time has passed, and every community deserves to be heard. As the camera pulls back to the wide Wyoming plains, the wind carries Elena's name. Where silence once covered her story, justice now speaks, long overdue but undeniable.